Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much. Thanks to Antonio and Julia for organizing this fantastic event. So my paper examines the geopolitical dimensions of two anti-imperialist thinkers of the early 20th century, Roosevelt Luxemburg and Nikolai Bukharin. Now, these two are often associated with geopolitics in the broad sense that they take interstate conflict and competition into account in their critiques of capitalism. My paper is trying to point to kind of a deeper connection with classical geopolitical thought in the way that I think their critiques of imperialism are informed by the kind of closed space theories of globalization that you find in the work of Mackinder, primarily, but of course a wide range of political thinkers of the time. For both of them, the elimination of an outside space, the capitalist order, transforms relations of production in ways that both unleashes colonial capitalist violence back on Europe and undermines the spatial fix that they argue has so far staved off the contradictions of capitalist accumulation. So I think by showing how these closed space theories of globalization inform both imperialist and anti-imperialist thinking, my paper is trying to kind of contribute to debates in the intellectual history of geopolitical thought, also about to debates on the relationship between the state system and global capitalism that you get in Marxist PE, for example. And it's linked to broader debates about the relationship between international and world order. Also debates about the spatial fix in political geography. And then maybe some broader conclusions about geopolitics and international relations. That's kind of a broader project, a book project that I'm working on in the history of geopolitical thought and the way, certain conceptions of systematic order orient the relationship between human beings, Earth, and political authority. So this is not going to be in the book, but it's a side thing that I thought was interesting enough to move forward. So I'll begin just with a basic outline of closed space theories of globalization, and then into details on Luxemburg and so closed space theories circulated widely in the early 20th century. Mackinder is probably the most well-known and influential proponent of these kinds of theories of globalization, but these are echoed by later thinkers like Carl Schmitt. What these theories share is a view of a spatially differentiated globe in which conflict and contradictions within the European state system are mitigated by hierarchical relations with spaces outside these borders, whether through territorial expansion or economic destruction. So these theories are often characterized by a view of non-European space as open or empty, of the kind of quote-unquote civilized political orders that would present an obstacle to spatial expansion. And for these kind of space theories, the ability of states and peoples to expand into new spaces is a crucial dimension of the moral, economic, and political development of nations and the species. So in this sense, globalization poses a considerable problem for these theories because it represented, in their view, the elimination of these kinds of outside, unappropriated spaces. So it's in this context that Mackinder is considering this process of globalization as a spatial closure. He calls the previous 400 years the Columbian Age, characterized by the mapping, exploration, and colonization flowed by European powers. And it's the culmination of this process, the complete mapping and occupation of the world, that brings the stage to a close. His view, so he writes, the world and its remotest borders, is funny, where we must chronicle its virtually complete political appropriations. With the culmination of this epoch, we shall again have to deal with a closed political system, and nonetheless, it will be one worldwide. So for Mackinder, the result of this closed unity is a kind of total interconnection that, far from heralding kind of a peaceful world order, is actually a significant political problem. So he writes, every explosion of social forces, instead of being dissipated into the surrounding circuit of unknown space and barbaric chaos, we sharply re-echoed from the other side of the globe. And Mackinder argues that this changing world environment will affect the nature of political conflict, writing that there's a vast difference in effect between the fall of a shell into an earthwork and a fall amid closed spaces and rigid structures of a great building or ship. So he's suggesting that the mapping of the Earth along global lines turns the world into a kind of human domain in which there's no outside. So then there's three elements here that we see reproduced in Luxemburg and Burles' work. First, this idea of a closed space, no outside. Second, this idea of a bifurcated world between that's characterized by hierarchical relationships between European and non-European spaces. And and the sense that the overcoming of that bifurcation will lead to a return of violence to Europe and transformation. So those three things I think you see in the anti-imperialist politics of Luxembourg. These two are most often actually considered theoretical antagonists, if political allies. Luxembourg has kind of a more structural account of the necessity of outside non-capitalist orders for accumulation, whereas Bukharin kind of argues for a more historical account of the development of monopoly capitalism and finance capital. But they share this geopolitical orientation. So for Luxembourg, capitalism is not a closed, self-contained system, but an open one that relies on non-capitalist spaces for its reproduction. And so for her, the spatial closure produced by globalization of capitalist empires threatens to eliminate the outside by which capitalists sustain accumulation. For Bukharin, globalization means that the national alliances, the alliances between national bourgeoisie and workers, that he thinks are kind of bought with wealth generated by colonial exploitation, will be overcome. The coming elimination of these outside spaces, they both consider catalysts of the transformation of the order and the dissolution of capitalist economy, essentially. So the way closed space theory informs Luxembourg's account is linked to her well-known critique of primitive accumulation, right? Which she argues this isn't something that just happens at the origin of capitalism, but it's a continual process required for its surplus value has to be realized outside the sphere of capitalist production. So capitalist orders have to look outside for new markets, new raw materials, workers. So she writes, capital needs other races to exploit territories where the white man cannot work. Must be able to exploit world labor power without restriction in order to utilize all productive forces of the globe. So the globe is this kind of horizon of capitalist development and imperial competition, the condition of possibility for accumulation. So by reaching the spatial limits of the globe and thus enclosing all previously non-capitalist space, Luxembourg believes means that there will eventually be no more outside fuel the engines of accumulation. More rapidly, violently, ruthlessly, and thoroughly imperialism brings about the decline of non-capitalist civilizations, she says, the more rapidly it cuts the very ground from under the feet of capitalist accumulation. She predicts that this closure will result in the return of violence, like Mackinder, from the periphery to the European core. Right, again, echoing Mackinder, she writes, what distinguishes imperialism as the last struggle for capitalist domination is the specific sign that the circle of development is beginning to close, the return of the decisive struggle for expansion from those areas which are being fought over back to its home countries. In this way, imperialism brings catastrophe as a mode of existence from the periphery of capitalist development. The war in Europe on her reading is the consequence of this newly enclosed world. Now, Bukharin is an explicit critic of geopolitical thought of the time. So in 1936, he wrote an article called Imperialism and Communism in Foreign Affairs, where he explicitly criticizes the geopolitics of the time as geographically determinist and an apology of fascism and imperialism. Despite this explicit opposition, he does share, I think, key dimensions with his geopolitical enemies, particularly in his book, Imperialism and the World Economy. And the problem he's addressing in this book is the persistence of nationalist sentiment. Right? The strength of nationalist sentiment stoked by the First World War and the collapse of the Second International. So he's trying to explain and understand this persistent proletarian nationalism. He argues it's not a domestic phenomenon, but the product of a world economy in this wider imperial context. Exploitation of peoples in the colonies lets nationalist bourgeoisie, he writes, buy the loyalty of domestic workers through wage rises, improved conditions at home, funded by the extraction of wealth in the colonies. So rather than solidarity with colonial peoples suffering capitalist exploitation, European workers side with national capitalists because they receive a piece of that wealth. So again, echoing Mackinder, Bukharin writes, capitalism has attempted to tame the working class and subdue social contradictions by decreasing the steam pressure through the aid of a colonial valve. Colonial territories function as a safety net for revolutionary energies by reinforcing national alliances between capital and labor. So the spatial division of the world economy into European and colonial territories resolves these kinds of contradictions that otherwise, in his view, lead to revolution. He also suggests, like Mackinder, that the closure of earthly space, represented by globalization, transforms the nature of international conflict. He says imperialist wars are universal, for the whole world is already divided up. Its wars confront all mankind with the dilemma, either death or socialism. The spatial closure of globalization results in a universal political and economic order, consequence of which is the elimination of prior limits on imperial violence. So recalling Mackinder's metaphor of a shell being dropped into a building or ship, Bukharin writes that imperialist conflict in a closed but universal spatial order presents an existential threat to humanity. He also believes, like Luxemburg and like Mackinder, that by eliminating the safety valve of non-European space, capitalism kind of prepares the way for its own destruction, what he calls the explosion of the whole capitalist boiler. So he kind of says that globalization, this kind of creation of a closed world order, will result in the dissolution of these ties between capital and labor and the emergence of a world proletariat. Without a spatial steam valve, he thinks the contradictions of capitalism will be kind of laid bare. So I think in those two critiques of imperialism, we see these three key dimensions of closed space theories of globalization. The sense of there's no longer an outside space world order, the kind of overcoming of this bifurcated world order, and the sense that violence will be returned to its sources in Europe. How much time do I have left?
You're good. Don't worry too much.
Okay. So I don't think I'll, the piece of this paper that needs development is kind of the consequences of this for various debates. So I have, maybe let's say 4 in mind. I think I'll focus on 2 of them for now. The first is kind of what this analysis suggests, or just this workshop is focused on, intellectual history of geopolitics. I think it points to the way that these geopolitical ideas circulated quite widely and are mobilized in relation to very, very different political projects. So it points to this key dimension of intellectual history, the mobility and malleability of concepts. So ideas core to imperialist geopolitics can lend themselves to critiques of imperialism, which might also point, of course, to some of the limits of these particular critiques of imperialism as well. So I think, and I imagine I'm preaching to the choir on this point, but rather than ceding geopolitical questions and concepts to a tradition of German geopolitics or kind of a resurgent right-wing internationalism, I think a critical analysis of the changing uses of these geopolitical concepts and how they're implicated in present-day critiques of and apologies for capitalism, imperialism, etc., can produce kind of a more critical and nuanced understanding of the geopolitical challenges today and the kind of intellectual resources that are available for responding. And then the last point I'll make is I think it's quite interesting, again, to see how these kind of basic ideas about spatial order orient political thinking. I always like to look at what's common amongst otherwise diametrically opposed political thought. And I think looking at these kind of orienting concepts is quite interesting in a context where the relationship, especially in terms of earthly space, where the relationship between human beings and the Earth is really in question in relation to climate change and a whole range of other issues. So in terms of how this kind of connects with international relations, I think it's so interesting to read these turn of the century geopolitical thinkers, because both the imperialist and the anti-imperialist versions of this account consider globalization a project of political appropriation, right? Political appropriation. And in many respects, international relations starts from that appropriation. And so it's quite instructive to go back and see that appropriation being put into question and actually posed as a question rather than as the foundation for an analysis. I think I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.